Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 to 35. This week we've been getting a new fire fitted in the lounge. The old gas fire has been pulled out by the workmen and a new log burner has been installed. But before the log burner could be installed, they had to do a lot of drilling. They had to drill out the old hearth and, of course, the space for the fire to go. Layer after layer of concrete and brick. And today we have to do some delayering with this passage. Some of what is written here is plain, but some of our initial understanding might need chipping away at. Some things are very complicated in this Bible passage, but eventually we'll be able to light the fire and warm ourselves. That warmth will be about the certainty of Christ's return. It will be about this age we live in now, finally passing. It should stoke the flames of our hope and expectation. So here's a plot spoiler. Jesus has said that he's going to come back again. A second and final return to wrap up this world. Some years ago I was talking to what I would call a real hard man. I'd been talking about how this life was temporary, and he said, "You know what, Vicar? I think we all know that in the end we stand before our judge." He was being honest that humans have nowhere to hide, that something in the human heart tells us that this day is coming. In today's text, Jesus is responding to a question from his disciples about when the end of the age will be. If you look at verse 3 from before our reading, "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" He then gives lots of signs that the end is coming. I'm just going to summarize them now without pointing to them in detail. People making false claims to be the Messiah, wars and nations rising up against nation, famines, earthquakes, destruction of the Jewish temple. Then he gives warnings, not to linger but to flee to the mountains when in the last days trouble comes on the earth. You'll find all these themes in chapter 4 of Matthew. Then in verse 27 he says that the coming of the Son of Man will be a visible public event, as clear as lightning in the sky. That's important because some cults have said that Christ has already returned, only it was in private and only their members know about it. Not so. No one will be in any doubt when Christ returns. Everyone will know that it's happened. It hasn't happened yet. Now, before we chip away at our passage and light the fire, I need to give a health warning. Some Christians have been very concerned to give times and dates for the return of Christ. My view of prophecy is that Jesus tells us clearly that it is folly to try and work out times and dates. Also, I think some of the detailed descriptions of rapture and tribulation with certain timelines written out is misguided. The purpose of prophecy in the Bible is not to give us history written in the future tense, but like a film preview or like hazard warning lights on the motorway, is to give us a general sense to lift our hearts in expectation and warning. Michael Green said something like that, the great evangelist and theologian. In fact, Green said this: "The date-fixing approach neglects this, and by its mixture of literalism and speculation militates against patient faith and social involvement." Taking a look at verse 29, after the distress of Christ's death, which I think is referred to by the vultures gathering around the carcass, referenced in verse 28, the sun, moon, and stars will be affected. Immediately after the distress of these days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The sun will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Is this the literal sun, moon, and stars falling from the sky or being shaken? Probably not. There may be all kinds of natural disasters and signs in the sky in the final days, particularly close to Christ's return, but I don't think that is what it is talking about here. You see, in verse 34, Jesus is going to say that the signs will happen in the lifetime of the disciples. Quote, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." The literal sun, moon, and stars have not fallen from the sky, but it might have a metaphorical meaning instead. If these signs were meant to happen in the same generation as the disciples, Do we just throw our hands in the air? C.S. Lewis called this verse certainly the most embarrassing verse in the Bible. It starts to get very confusing when you read verse 30. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Here's the problem. Did Jesus promise that he would return and end history in the lifetime of some of his hearers? Was it a huge mistake? Maybe when Jesus said, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened, he didn't mean literal generation. Maybe there was another translation of the word generation. Well, I'm not sure about that. I'm in the camp of sticking with what the verse most clearly seems to say, which is that the signs of Jesus' return would happen in a close number of years to his earthly life. So let's return to a metaphorical reading for verse 29. Here's how I think verse 29 should be read. Metaphorically. Many modern scholars think that verse 29 needs to be read in historical context, which is that of the Romans capturing Jerusalem in AD 70, after 4 years of siege and the destruction of the temple that followed. You'll know well that the Romans were ruling in Jerusalem during Christ's earthly life. You might also have heard of the Jewish War in AD 66 to AD 70, although the Jewish War is less well known. The Jews had rebelled and kicked the Romans out. And then we had this period of what is known as the Jewish War. For 4 years, the Romans sieged Jerusalem and tried to starve out the inhabitants. A historian at the time says that in desperation, even some Jews turned to cannibalism. Many would have felt in the Jewish nation like it was the literal end of the world. The city was reduced to rubble. We're told by Josephus, the historian of the day, that the temple was set alight, that slaughter ensued and bodies were piled up around the altar. More than 1 million Jews died, and Josephus, who was there, tells us that 97,000 were captured. It certainly would have felt like the heavenly bodies were being shaken. Read in this context, it seems likely that the sun being darkened, the moon withholding its light, stars falling from the sky, and the heavenly bodies being shaken seems like fitting poetic language for, as Green puts it, the universal panic, distress, and imminent collapse of Jerusalem. So the old order fell and the temple fell. The symbolism of Old Testament religion. In this reading, this sign did indeed happen within the lifetime of some of the disciples, but it was metaphorical. Then verse 30, how are we to understand that? Well, I'm with those who argue that this verse is not referring to Christ's second coming, but his ascension to heaven. I think that this makes a lot more sense personally. The sign in heaven is his ascension, Christ's ascension, which came to be widely known and proclaimed by the Christian church. You see, it says, and then all peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. I'm taking this as referring to the ascension. This verse is referencing Daniel chapter 7. When we read it in Daniel, it doesn't feel like a return to earth of the Son of Man, but rather a return to heaven. See what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 7. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Okay, so this is the coming on the clouds bit. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. So it's not a return to earth, but it is a return to heaven on the clouds. You see, when Christ came on the clouds of heaven, it was to go up and to ascend into heaven. He was led into the Father's presence. Christ will one day return on the clouds of heaven, but I don't think that's what Matthew is recording Jesus talking about here. Rather, he's recording one of the signs that again did occur within the life of that generation. Then verse 31, the next sign that we're in the end times, the gathering by angels. Angels is just the Greek word we can also translate as messenger. I think we'd be wiser to translate it as messenger really here. Tom Wright is one of the theologians that would argue for this, and he says, what people will see is strange messengers, alone or in small groups, travelling around from country to country, telling people that a recently executed Jewish prophet has been vindicated by God, that he is the Messiah and the Lord of the world. You see, the sign is one of world evangelization, people being gathered into the kingdom as they hear the gospel message being taken out by messengers, people who've come to believe it themselves. The sign of the end times is salvation being announced everywhere, beyond the borders of Judea. The disciples would all go to different countries preaching. See, these things all taken together were signs that we're in the final days. These final days have been in place since the time of the early church. For 2,000 years, roughly, we've been in what you would call the final days. Now, someone might say, there doesn't seem to be any cause to believe it, that it could happen any day that Christ returns. But you have to remember, God doesn't count days like we do. From his view, it's almost the blink of an eye since the New Testament events that we read of. Like, when a fig tree is ripe, we should realise that the conditions are ripe for fruit. Well, we should know that the world is ripe now for Christ's return. Having seen these things, these signs actually fulfilled, we know that the day is near. You might say the engine is primed for ignition. Or football fans, the football is on the penalty spot, ready for kicking. The footsteps are on the path that lead to the door. True, we have enough entertainment now and things to be getting on with to forget this, to tell ourselves that it isn't so if we really want to. But the wise person learns that God can act at any time he wants. We don't know the date, but we are encouraged to live expectantly. It could be today, as we have reminded ourselves as the church very often. So let's remember that key signs are in place. Number one, the temple has fallen. That was a big event in AD 70 and a big fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Secondly, Christ has ascended to heaven. Thirdly, messengers have been gathering in the elect, preaching the gospel and seeing people saved from every nation. So I hope that you know that we live in the final days. The season since Christ's ascension, when he says that at any time he might return from heaven. Has the chaos you've seen in your lifetime not underlined for you that it feels like we're in the final times? The fire of our hope that we warm ourselves on is that the children of God have a day to look forward to when there will be no more struggle, no more of the suffering that we experience. Some of us now are hurting. Some of us are experiencing deep pain, real deep pain in our spirits. We feel small against the challenges that face us. Some of us are experiencing the devil trying to disrupt our relationships and our lives. But none of these things have the last word. The last word will be the powerful return of the King, and oh, what a wonderful day it will be. One day in his presence will make up for all these hurts. This world will seem to us then, when we are with Christ, it will seem to us like a distant dream from a foreign land. So, brothers and sisters, be sure the footsteps of Jesus are almost at the door.